A federal judge strikes down the under 21 handgun sales ban, plus Cam Edwards of bearing arms on the Tennessee red flag proposal, and Trump's defense of the bump stock ban. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. To keep up to date with guns in America, you will get access to lots of stories that you will not find anywhere else. And if you want to go even further, you can buy a membership to help support our reporting and get access to member-exclusive pieces of analysis and reporting. And this podcast, you'll get it a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show. So stay tuned. We actually have a member segment this week that I think everyone should tune in for and listen to. It's one of my favorite parts of the show. But my other favorite part is when I get to talk to the expert guests we have on. This week, we have Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms, who is another person who produces a lot of great gun reporting and writing out there. Welcome back to the show. You've been on a couple times before, Cam. We always love having you on.
Listen, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks for the invite, and I'm glad to see you. And I will say that I also have a guest kind of lurking around. So if you hear a rooster in the background at some point over the course of the podcast, Mr. Crow is an attention hog. So yeah, you might hear him at some point. He's just kind of wandering around the office right now.
Is he inside your office?
No, he's outside. But my office
is not a house rooster?
Is basically like a little shed. So it's separate from the house, and it's a portable shed. So he's just kind of doing circles with his hens around the portable shed. And yeah, he knows as soon as I do an interview. It happened earlier today too. I was talking to a radio station out in Oregon, and as soon as I started talking, he decided he had to have the last word. So just warning your listeners and viewers.
I think it adds charm to the interview. Although I can't stand my mom's rooster up on the farm in Pennsylvania. That thing, yeah. I mean, as soon as the sun comes up, they're making noise.
Oh, and all day. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop once the sun comes up. It's all day long. But Mr. Crow's a good rooster. He's been with us for about 5 years. He manages to keep the chickens safe most of the time. So yeah, we've got a pretty good relationship.
Well, there you go. That's good. Well, hopefully we'll get his commentary later. But I want to start with what I think is the most interesting fight going on in the states right now as far as gun policy is concerned. And that's in Tennessee over this proposal from Governor Bill Lee, who's a Republican. Obviously, Republicans have majorities in both houses of their legislature there as well. But Governor Lee wants to implement, he's calling it an order of protection law. Most people would call this a red flag law. He's very reticent to label it that. He thinks it's a political label that he doesn't agree with. But can you just give us what's the latest there going on in the state there? He just called for a special session, right?
Yeah, so he called for a special session in August, which I think is designed to give his administration and some of the legislative leaders who backed his proposal time to do some lobbying with lawmakers, because I think it's going to be Republicans who are most reticent to do this. Democrats see any opening as a good thing, right? So even though this doesn't go nearly as far as they would like, it's a step in the right direction. So they're already going to be on board. You got to convince Republicans, or at least enough Republicans, to get a majority. And I know that Governor Lee, just from a political standpoint, doesn't want to see this pass just because a bare minimum number of Republicans signed on, right? He wants this to have true bipartisan support. And so I think that's why he's kicked the special session back until August. But as far as the particulars of this proposal goes, you're right. Governor Lee has said, don't call this a red flag law. It's a temporary mental health restraining order. But it's not. Because to me, if we're talking about a mental health restraining order, we're talking about restraining an individual because of their mental health concerns, right? And this ultimately is still about taking their guns away. It's not about getting them any sort of treatment. It's not about, the criminal justice system stepping in. It is a gun-centric approach to dealing with supposedly dangerous individuals. So I object to red flag laws on that basis. I think they just go in the wrong direction. But what's interesting, as you say, is that what he's proposing really is different from virtually all of the red flag laws that are on the books. So no ex parte hearings, right? No ex parte hearings. If you are the subject of a petition, you get to be at every court hearing, which is a good thing, right? That alleviates some of the due process concerns. There is mental health involvement in terms of determining whether or not you're a danger to yourself or somebody else. You have the ability to transfer your firearms to a third party. Doesn't have to be that the police go and confiscate your firearms. So, there are some, and by the way, you're also entitled to a representation. If you can't afford an attorney, you get access to a public defender. That's a good thing. And again, that's something that's absent from almost every red flag law in place. So I'll give Governor Lee credit for listening to the concerns of gun owners about due process protections. I think that those are addressed. I still think that the underlying premise, however, takes us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so we'll get into some of the critiques there, that main overarching critique, but I want to get into some of these differences that are in this initial proposal, at least. Now, I guess this could obviously change as they approach the actual session, which is now a couple months away. But yeah, let's go over a little more detail about how this law works compared to how basically every other red flag law works. Because you're right, so I guess initially the police officer is the only one who can file these requests under this law, is my understanding. And it is, so one of the reasons he's calling this an order of protection instead of a red flag law is that it's expanding on something that already exists in Tennessee, right? They already have this process for somebody who's accused of domestic violence to go through and to have their guns removed temporarily. It's a similar idea as what he's proposing here. He just wants to expand it, I guess, to include these people who've been determined to be a threat to themselves or others. And so there are a number of differences with this process and with most processes. Like you mentioned, most of them, it's an ex parte process. And a lot of people can really apply for one of these or can petition a court. A lot of states are letting teachers or mental health professionals or roommates or relatives do this in addition to police officers. So that's one significant difference. The other one, the first one, is this ex parte aspect of the process, where in most states you file a petition, there's a hearing, you're not informed of the hearing. If you're the subject of the petition, you're not present at the hearing. And then a judge at that hearing decides whether or not there's enough evidence. And the standard is, I think it's the same level of standard in this proceeding as in most of them, which is sort of clear and convincing evidence standard, which is, a lower level, obviously, than a criminal standard, which is beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt. Right.
Right.
And so, instead of having a judge issue an order before the person being accused of being a threat is even aware of the proceedings, this Tennessee bill would make it so that not only would they have to be at the hearing when this happens, but they would get legal representation if they can't provide their own, and they would have to go through a mental health screening by law. Right, this requirement of part of this process instead of, so it's based on an actual mental health professional's evaluation of the individual. And so, I don't know, from your point of view, how significant are those differences?
Well, I think they are significant. Again, but here's the other thing. These protections, right? These improvements over a standard red flag law are also the very things that Democrats in Tennessee are already objecting to. Right? They said, well, you have to have these ex parte hearings because what if there's an emergency? What if there's, an imminent danger, and you're going to tell this dangerous person, hey, 2 weeks from now, show up in courts because we want to take your guns away. What on earth could that lead to? So, for everything that Bill Lee is trying to do to mollify gun owners and Second Amendment supporters, I think it's, angering the gun control activists, because they are the ones who've written these red flag laws, right? So they know what they want, and they know what they think works, quote unquote. And it has to be baked into the cake that you have to be able to go and get the guns right away. And if that means that the person isn't aware that this hearing is being held, they're not allowed to present a defense, well, so be it, right? You can come back a couple of weeks later, and then they get to have their day in court. So, that's how most red flag laws work. I like the idea, again, of providing these due process protections, but I can see this argument already being raised by anti-Democrats that this doesn't go far enough. Let's say that there is an incident after, let's say that the lawmakers, pass this temporary mental health restraining order, and then somebody who was in the process of, having their guns taken away goes on to commit a violent crime. Democrats are going to point to that right away and say, aha, see, look, you've got to get rid of that provision. It's too weak. The law is basically meaningless. And I think that should be another concern for gun owners, Stephen, that, if you put a useless law on the books, well, the people who support a stronger version of that law are then going to get to argue, hey, look, we need to remove these protections, right? We need to expand who can file for these petitions because this law isn't working the way it is. If you take that first step, I think it does lead to a slippery slope in this case. And that's why, again, if you're going to be talking about ways to prevent these types of attacks, I think you've got to look at the individual and not just their gun ownership. And so, I would prefer that they actually take a look at actually bolstering the mental health laws and the mental health provisions in Tennessee, rather than trying to label a gun law, however well-intentioned, a mental health proposal.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so, because I guess the core issue we're trying to address, right, with these sorts of ideas, is the person who is throwing off warning signs that they're potentially going to harm themselves or others, right? Making direct threats about it. There's a lot of warning signs that can come into this sort of thing, but they haven't actually committed a crime yet, or a serious enough crime that they warrant felony conviction or domestic violence misdemeanor or something along those lines that would permanently keep them from owning guns legally. And so the solution is how do you stop somebody like that? And that's where these red flag laws come in. And then obviously I think as you're talking about here, a lot of gun rights advocates would say involuntary commitment is the better option, right? That's basically what the argument, right?
I think so. And listen, the downside of that is once you have been involuntarily committed, you lose your right to keep your arms forever. Right. It's not temporary. It is a more extreme step. But if we're talking about people who are truly dangerous, either to themselves or others, there already is a process in place by which those individuals can be confined to a mental health facility until they are no longer a danger to themselves or others. And that seems like a more substantial approach. One of the other concerns I have about this, Stephen, is that while I appreciate the fact that a public defender could be appointed, I appreciate the fact that there are mental health screenings involved here. Those things come with a price, and those things come with personnel. We already have a problem finding enough public defenders in many jurisdictions across this country. Cases are being dismissed because, they don't have enough public defenders to go around. And so you're seeing these lengthy delays and people's rights are being violated. So adding more burdens to an already burdened system concerns me. Something's going to have to give. We just saw the New York State Police Union come out today and say that Governor Hochul's mandating of the use of red flag laws has left them unable to investigate a lot of serious crimes because so many resources are being devoted to going after these supposedly dangerous people and their guns. There's been 1,000% increase in the number of red flag petitions that have been filed over the past year in New York. Some of the New York State Police barracks are running out of room to hold all of the guns that have been confiscated. And the police union is now speaking up. They're not speaking out against red flag laws. I think they want more funding, right, to be able to do both. But this is having an impact. And this is what, strict enforcement of a red flag policy looks like. Even if you're not a gun owner, you should be a little concerned about the impact that this is going to have on public safety if finite police resources are being devoted to going after, somebody who might be a danger to themselves or others versus somebody who's committed a violent felony. And the same holds true with our mental health system, too. Tennessee, like almost every other state, has a shortage of mental health professionals. So if we're now tasking them with doing a mental health screening, not for an involuntary commitment, but to simply take somebody's guns away, again, I worry that at the very least is not a good use of resources. And at the worst, again, may allow some truly dangerous people to do terrible things because, we adopted the idea that, well, if we take their guns away, that solves the problem.
Right. What if the policy is coupled with some sort of mandatory mental health treatment as part of the order? Would that, I'm just trying to get to, is there a potential proposal in this vein of temporary removal of firearms because somebody is a threat to themselves or others that would sort of actually address all of the issues that you just outlined? I mean, because there's obviously are a lot of legitimate issues, and this is a serious topic, right? We're talking about somebody's rights, and we're talking about the safety of the community around them and their own safety as well. And so what, to me, I've always looked at the critiques of red flag laws, and they've seemed like they're addressable because a lot of them are based on the due process concerns. Well, this proposal has a number of ways of trying to address those concerns, but it doesn't hit sort of the overarching critique that you've outlined here of like, well, if this person is really a threat to themselves or others, why would you stop at just removing the firearms? There's obviously other ways that people can kill themselves or other people. We saw this in Texas recently, right? Somebody drove their SUV into a crowd of people and killed 8. Is there a way to try and reform these proposals to actually address all of those issues?
I don't think so. I mean, not to my mind. Because again, if the fundamental premise is about removing the gun and not dealing with the individual, then I think we're going in the wrong direction. And red flag laws, by their very nature, are gun centric. Again, they were written by gun control groups. They were, designed by gun control groups. They're not meant to be an all encompassing way to address dangerous people. They're a way to go after what they say are dangerous guns in the hands of people who may or may not be a danger. So I don't think you can square that circle. I really don't, because, and I understand why, again, these red flag laws are somewhat popular with politicians. They're a cheap fix. I'm actually very curious to see what the fiscal impact will be for Governor Lee's proposal when we start to get some actual hard numbers coming out about, what's this going to cost to provide a public defender? What's it going to cost to provide mental health screening? This, I think, is a way for lawmakers to say they have done something without having to spend a lot of money, either reforming the mental health system, adding more public defenders to the rolls, adding maybe more judges to the rolls. This allows them to do something on the cheap. But I think at the expense of our rights, and again, at the expense of leaving dangerous people alone to do dangerous things.
Right. I mean, I guess, if the answer is involuntary commitment, I just wonder if there isn't some way that is every person who's a threat to themselves or others who has these mental health crises, is that sort of step of putting them in a facility the only solution, right? I mean, removing their access to firearms and mandating that they get mental health treatment. I don't know if that's how much different that is from involuntary commitment, I guess, in the first place. But if it's a more temporary solution, with a little bit of a reduced burden, I guess, on trying to, because one of the issues with involuntary commitment is it's very difficult to actually get somebody through that process, right? That's my understanding, at least. That I'm not as much of an expert on involuntary commitments and how hard they are, but my understanding is they're very difficult to actually do. And so that's where, like, is there some way to do that same level of process, but it's temporary, so the deprivation of rights isn't as severe. It's coupled with the mental health treatment that you're, I think, persuasively saying is necessary if you do believe somebody is that much of a threat to themselves or others. Is there some middle way there?
Well,
just not?
I mean, maybe another approach would be, instead of trying to, reinvent the wheel with a red flag law, let's just reform the involuntary commitment laws. So if it's too difficult, now listen, I'm a fan of all of our civil rights, not just the right to keep and bear arms. So
right.
I don't want to see a situation where people can get, locked up and involuntarily committed just because somebody says, oh, you know what, they said something that disturbed me. What I think we actually need, and one of the reasons why I think it is so difficult for these involuntary commitments to happen again is because we haven't funded the mental health system. There aren't enough beds to go around. You and I are in Virginia, where routinely individuals who are in crisis are sitting in jail cells, or they're sitting in ER rooms, for 24 to 48 hours with a deputy, by the way, sitting right beside them, unable to go out on patrol because there aren't enough spaces. There aren't enough beds available for these people. So regardless of red flag laws, that's an issue that needs to be addressed. But I think if we looked at this as a mental health problem, which is supposedly what we're doing here, then maybe an involuntary commitment shouldn't lead to a lifetime prohibition on the right to keep and bear arms. What if an involuntary commitment led to a temporary removal of your ability to own a firearm? But again, once you are no longer a danger to yourself or others, your rights can be restored. That to me seems like a much better way of approaching this than trying to shoehorn a red flag law into being able to negate the dangerousness of somebody while still leaving them out on the street. So, maybe we just need to look at it from a different direction.
No, that's definitely a very interesting idea. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's just so much that goes into this. It's not an easy answer, right? There's just not going to be a super simple solution. I do think that watching what's going on in Tennessee is important because it seems to be one of the first times where people have taken a policy like red flag laws and actually tried to do something to address the critiques. Whether or not it succeeds, I think, is a whole nother question, right? Like we're discussing here, but
Maine did
just
it
push the
as
same
well with their, I think they call it a yellow flag law. And they actually worked with the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. They're actually involved in writing that legislation. And again, there is a mental health provision both before and after, a finding of dangerousness. So, but again, that was sort of a one-off. And this is the first time we've seen a Republican governor try to take these steps, right? It was Janet Mills in Maine who, helped the yellow flag law. But this is, as you say, I mean, Governor Bill Lee, he's a staunch conservative. He signed constitutional carry into law. So it is interesting, from a political perspective to see him decide to do this. And this is, I think, it's not a policy question, but it is a political question. Are Republicans likely starting to feel the heat and the need to, quote, do something? And are they worried that this is going to actually be enough of an issue in 2024 that Republicans are going to lose seats because the American public sees them as out of step and out of touch with where they are on public safety concerns?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a growing question and a growing concern for the gun rights movement generally, right? Even though, as we've talked about in the past, the polling cycle is fairly consistent when it comes to, the aftermath of mass shootings, the support for gun control and various policies tends to go up, although we've seen support for AR-15 bans or so-called assault weapons bans has actually not followed that trend recently, which is fascinating and, something for a whole podcast topic perhaps down the line. But and then a few months later, it tends to revert back to where it was. But I think what you've seen in a lot of polling is that new normal, when support comes back down, is still higher than the old level of support, which is a problem if you're a gun rights advocate, because at some point there may be more of a tipping point. I mean, we saw Congress pass the first new gun restrictions in decades last year. And, it's not clear that that's the end of it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the Republican messaging, frankly, has been terrible. Tim Burchett from Tennessee, he was the congressman who said, there's nothing you can do about it. And then he has backed off of that statement. And now he's, I think, supporting some version of a red flag law. When you talk about this, and I think we're playing into this game where the gun control advocates want it to be, you care more about your rights than you do about children being murdered, right? And so when we make this a rights-based argument, when we say, well, it's all about due process protections, it's all about not infringing on my right to keep and bear arms, gun owners are a minority in this country. We may be right, but that's not an argument that is going to persuade a lot of non-gun owners who are, consuming anti-gun media and are convinced that the only way to address these problems is to ban so-called assault weapons or even repeal the Second Amendment altogether, I guess. I think we have to offer alternatives. I think we have to point out why we object to these things. And it's not because we don't care about kids. It's not because, listen, Stephen, you know this. My son, my oldest son passed away last year. And he died of alcoholism. I'll say it here. He died a week before his 31st birthday. And my wife and I found him dead in his bed. So I've looked at a dead child who I love very much. But I don't support the prohibition of alcohol. I'm not calling for prohibition too, because I know that would be ineffective. That wouldn't save lives. We have 100,000 Americans dying from alcohol abuse every year. And, trying to ban booze isn't the answer. Similarly, banning guns isn't the answer when we're trying to stop, the 40,000 Americans every year who are dying from suicide or homicide. That's the wrong approach. And so if we do care about our kids and we're not just interested in using them as political talking points, then I think it's actually gun control advocates who have to be open-minded enough to look beyond gun control as a solution, or as, if not a solution, certainly as something that can reduce these numbers and bring them down.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly, because if you read the research on, especially in particular, mass shootings and mass shooters, what you'll find, I've talked to, the researchers behind the Violence Project. We had them on a podcast just recently. But there's a very close correlation between suicidal ideation and mass shooter ideation, or like somebody who's considering mass shootings is very similar mental crisis, a downward spiral. And I think a lot of the solutions for mass shootings are in the end going to be pretty similar to the solutions for suicide, right? That's to me, it seems fairly straightforward. And so while mental health becomes sort of a generic talking point in the aftermath of mass shootings, it really is the key. Getting proper mental health treatment on a broad basis too is the most probably effective thing you can do to counter mass shootings, especially because mass shootings are so random and difficult to predict. You can see different factors that a lot of mass shooters have in common, but you can't build a profile off that because there are a lot of people who have those same factors. A lot of people who own guns, who've been in a mental health crisis before, who've gone through childhood trauma, who do not turn out to be somebody that is going to take out those issues on other people. and so that's where, a more broad-based approach of just greater mental health treatment, perhaps with a specialized program for identifying and off-ramping people who could potentially become mass shooters, is the right way forward. And I guess the individual policies of how you do that are where it gets much more complicated, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair statement.
But I also wanted to talk a little bit about some other Republican politics. Right? This is a little bit in the politics realm, but Donald Trump was just on CNN at a town hall, and in it he was asked by a voter about the bump stock ban that he imposed during his presidency, right? And his response, and I'll just read the quote real quick here. He said, quote, "As you know, the bump stocks are actually a very unimportant thing. NRA, I went with them and they said it doesn't mean anything, or actually all they do is teach you how to shoot very inaccurately. So we did that." And I just want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's pretty relevant to the primary here, because when I look at Donald Trump's record, there seems to be a fairly good opening to his right on this issue, as far as what he's actually accomplished while president. This obviously doesn't mean that there were no pro-gun things that he did. There were, but he is the person behind the bump stock ban, which has now twice been ruled unconstitutional by federal appeals courts. And I'm interested in how you think him doubling down on support for this and sort of citing the NRA as, his general blanket protection for him doing this will actually play in this upcoming election.
Well, I mean, among gun owners in particular, I don't know how well it's going to play. Blaming the NRA, and as you pointed out at the Reload, the NRA was initially supportive of reclassifying bump stocks, and then when the final rule was published, they ended up opposing it. So to claim, well, I mean, listen, the NRA was the voice of authority. I think it probably was the case when it came to President Trump. We have heard that Trump was also initially in favor of a ban on so-called assault weapons, but was talked out of it by the NRA. That right. We've all seen his comment publicly about, take the guns now and due process later. Right. Apparently that was another, position that he walked back after, talking to folks at the NRA. So it may very well be that Donald Trump isn't just, throwing the NRA under the bus, but he's accurately describing how he came to that position. Oh, yeah. The problem is that, again, I think for some gun owners, the NRA's image has certainly been tarnished over the past couple of years. And so I don't know that that's really going to matter as an excuse. The other issue that I think that Trump has is that bump stock ban opened the door for what we've seen with the Biden administration. And so if he's not willing to acknowledge, I mean, look, even if you were to say, look, I got bad advice from the NRA, that would be one thing, right? But to say, well, this is unimportant. Well, it's not unimportant. Right. You might think bump stocks are unimportant. You might think stabilizing braces are unimportant, or, building your own gun doesn't really matter. But all of these things are building towards bigger and broader bans enacted not by Congress, but through an administrative rule that comes complete with, a federal prison sentence for those who might violate it. So, the issue is important, even if you don't think bump stocks are. And I think that Trump failed to appreciate that or acknowledge that during the town hall last night. So you're right. I think there is an opening to the right of Donald Trump. Whether that's enough to actually stop Donald Trump's popularity right now, I think remains to be seen, because I think there are a lot of Trump supporters who are willing to overlook particular disagreements they might have with him in favor of, the candidate overall. Yeah, that's sort of been part of his magic as a politician since he got in, right? It's certainly not the first time that he's taken a position that was unorthodox among Republican base. And oftentimes he's been able to push the Republican base towards
what his positions were. And sometimes he changes them. It depends. But real quick, let's go over exactly what happened with the bump stock ban for anybody who's forgotten how this went down. Because you and I were reporting on this at the time, right? And obviously, the Las Vegas shooting happens. It's the worst mass shooting in American history. Still is. That shooter used guns that had bump stocks equipped to them. And that's why this became an especially controversial thing. There was a push in Congress to pass legislation to ban them. The NRA opposed that because the definition that they had come up with in this was a Democratic bill was very broad and could have been really almost any trigger that made you shoot capable of shooting a gun slightly faster. So, perhaps just a lighter trigger would have been illegal under this proposal. So the NRA was opposed to that. And then they came out with a statement that said, the Obama, ironically, they said the Obama administration wrongly classified bump stocks as stocks instead of machine guns, because what a bump stock does is that it allows you to fire a gun at a fast pace. We've shot one together, actually. It was the time that I've shot a bump stock was at your place, your old place, right, or a friend's property. But
a friend's property, yeah,
yeah, and so that's what set in motion the Trump administration's, or at least gave them cover to pursue the rulemaking process as a way of banning bump stocks, as a way of sort of reclassifying them ex post facto as machine guns. Now, this was done, to be fair to the NRA, because they thought that was the more politically viable route. They didn't want this legislation to happen. They thought there was going to be some sort of response, and they thought this was the less disruptive response. That is, I think, the line that if you were talking to somebody off the record about it, that's how they would explain it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, and I the question is again whether or not that's right, whether or not there was enough pressure that Democrat bill would have passed, right? Mm-hmm. But it's silly to ignore the politics of this. We can talk about shall not be infringed. We can talk about what the text of the Second Amendment says all day long. But again, every day politicians abuse our constitutional rights, not just our Second Amendment rights. So, they're playing politics, right? They're looking at, okay, how is this going to impact our majorities? Yeah. Right. And so I think that there was that feeling at the time that, yes, there had to be some type of response.
I do think that it didn't actually work out that way in practice, right? Because the rulemaking process takes a year. Yeah. And so maybe it was enough of a pressure relief valve that it kept Congress from doing something on this, but it took them a whole year to get this bill in practice. Then when the rule came out, the NRA didn't like it because it didn't allow for people who already had them to keep them, right? It was a confiscation order. You couldn't keep them. It was a federal felony if you did keep them, which I believe a lot of people did keep them, but so it kind of makes a mockery of the whole justice system anyway. But regardless, it's not like he got a lot of credit for doing this when it actually went into effect. I remember Ali Velshi on MSNBC at the day this went into effect. It was like a 5-second thing. He mentioned it. And that was it. There was no political who. I don't know that they really got any political capital. The best that you could say is that they maybe released some pressure with that legislation, but even that I think is questionable.
I do too. And I mean, again, I think that you can make the very same case about Bill Lee's temporary mental health restraining order. I think that's, if you want to be nice, he sincerely believes that this is a way to address mass shootings without violating anybody's Second Amendment rights. If you want to be politically cynical, this, again, is a pressure valve, right? This allows Republicans, if they get on board, to say, look, we did something without banning guns or things of that nature, and in the hopes that will be enough. Again, for gun control activists, it's never going to be enough. It just becomes another talking point that Republicans didn't do the right thing, right? That they cowed to the gun lobby and didn't pass strong red flag legislation. It just becomes another argument. So I'm with you. I don't know that there's, I don't know how much pressure actually gets released, maybe in the short term. But in the long term, I think moves like this play to the gun control lobby, not to Second Amendment supporters. It ends up putting us on the defense. It gives them an opening that they are more than happy to exploit. And they're really good about playing the long game.
Yeah. And so just back to Trump's, I guess, record here, or the politics of guns in the Republican primary. Obviously Trump had other accomplishments, right? His only thing on guns wasn't the bump stock ban. He signed the Congressional Review Act bill when he first got into office that removed President Obama's attempt to restrict some Social Security recipients from owning guns. Right, that was really one of the only legislative accomplishments he had on the. Now, obviously, he's dealing with a Senate where
legislature, right?
Yeah, I mean, dealing with a Senate where you don't have 60 votes,
right?
But
he also, listen, a lot of his administrative actions were supportive. I don't think Trump was an anti-gun president. Right. I don't think you can call him that, right? I mean, even during the early days of the pandemic when, the firearms industry was declared essential.
Yes, that's another accomplishment.
Right. And a big one. I mean, I think that, went a long way towards keeping gun stores open in some states during the initial stages of COVID.
And then obviously the biggest one he had is appointing 3 Supreme Court justices who were in the majority in Bruin, which is by far his most significant accomplishment on guns. Now it's obviously just a general accomplishment on appointing justices that Republicans like. Now, of course, part of the question with that is that's his biggest accomplishment, but it's also something that how much doubt is there that DeSantis or Abbott or Scott or any of these other people, Haley, who are challenging him, who may challenge him, would they have appointed different justices given the opportunity? Probably not, but that's the political debate you get into with this stuff. I guess the real question is you look at somebody like DeSantis, right? He's the guy running second, a fairly distant second at this point, but he's running second, and he's seemed to use this legislative session to really bolster his bona fides on a lot of issues, but guns in particular, right? He passed permitless carry. He passed this new banking regulation that prevents any a bank from dropping somebody because they own guns or they run a gun business, among other things. And so he's kind of building this resume that would put him perhaps positioned to take advantage of this vulnerability that Trump has on things like the bump stock ban. Do you think that is a viable strategy?
I mean, listen, I don't think you can go wrong in a Republican primary by, supporting the Second Amendment. So I think this will be beneficial. And listen, I expect if DeSantis starts rising in the poll, a Trump line of attack might be, well, Ron DeSantis, signed constitutional carry, but it doesn't include open carry, right? Or Ron DeSantis, as he supports concealed carry, but he bans guns from his campaign events. If you're looking for the Second Amendment purist in this field of 2 that we're just talking about right now, I think you can find people who are, I think the 2 candidates are probably 90% there. But both of them have done things that are going to tick off some gun control owners, some gun owners, and some segment of supporters. GOA was lobbying to get open carry included in the permitless carry bill all session long.
They haven't repealed some of the bills that were passed in 2018, like the red flag law that Florida has, and the 18 to 20-year-old ban on. Well, they ban them from buying any guns, right, in Florida. Those things. That one is likely. It was just upheld by a panel in the Seventh Circuit, but it's about to go on banc, where you probably expect it to get blocked or struck down. But there's as you're saying there, I think there's certainly lines of attack on DeSantis from the right on guns. Do you think there's maybe a more maybe Abbott in Texas has certainly passed a lot of pro-gun legislation in his time there. Do you think or Kemp in Georgia? I don't know. Is there a better candidate?
Listen, I think there are any number of, good candidates. Whether or not they've got the mojo to actually, have an impact in the race is something else entirely. As the polling's indicated, right? It really is sort of a two-person race right now, and Trump has a pretty commanding lead over DeSantis.
Yep.
I'll tell you the person that I was actually most impressed by. I wasn't in Indianapolis for the annual meetings this year, as you know, and I miss seeing you there. But I did watch the forum, and Chris Sununu actually was the guy who impressed me the most out of everybody who spoke. I knew Chris Sununu was a pro 2A guy.
Yeah.
But his message where he's talking about you've got to stand up for your principles, even when people are saying, do something. I mean, it was almost a rebuke of Bill Lee before Bill Lee, made this call for a special session. And I was, that's somebody who, again, I don't think that Chris Sununu is going to be the next president. I don't think he's going to be the Republican nominee. I could be wrong, but I don't see it happening. But
he's from a very small state, even with everything else considered.
He is. But he
certainly injected a lot of energy, and he does have a pretty different message from most everyone else in the field, in that seems to be pointing more towards convincing maybe moderates or swing voters to come over. Seems to be his main sticking point, I feel like.
Yeah, you got to grow. I mean, I think this is something that is a concern for conservatives generally, but certainly with the Second Amendment. You can't just talk to yourself. You can't just talk to other Second Amendment supporters, right? You've got to be able to reach outside the tribe, because again, we're not a majority of the country. So if we're only talking to ourselves and the gun control advocates get to talk to everybody else, I mean, why would we do that to ourselves? Why would we put ourselves in that position? So, again, I think I don't think so far I've not seen what I would consider to be an anti-gun candidate who's, announced that they're running for president on the Republican side, which is good. There might be some slight variations, but I think really it's going to come down to, who presents the best argument, who has the best message, who can best represent us as gun owners, because I think they'll all do a pretty decent job of defending our right to keep and bear arms.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good summary of where the field's at on this issue right now. I think, Trump is clearly ahead, but it's also, and DeSantis is clearly the closest competitor, but it's also super early.
I was going to say, it's early, man. Like, if this were a football game, the pregame show wouldn't even be on yet. Yeah. So
right.
Exactly. And as crazy as our politics is, there's going to be lots of twists and turns between now and the first primary.
If you look at basically every other primary that's ever happened, usually the person leading at the beginning, like Beto O'Rourke was leading the Democratic primary in 2020 at one point, early on, and then he finished by dropping out with 0% support. So,
right.
It's not necessarily like these things are going to go exactly how you expect them to go this far out. But I do think Trump has some vulnerabilities in this area, and him doubling down on support for the bump stock ban is not necessarily something that is going to, change the entire dynamic of the race. But it does show an area where his rivals could come at him from, I think. So.
Absolutely. And I think they would be dumb to ignore that opportunity, because Trump certainly is not going to ignore any opportunity to go after DeSantis on these issues. So
that's for sure. Trump is never going to give up any opportunity to go after anyone he feels like he has to. So, but you're going to be following this, I'm sure, just like we are. So where can people find more of your writing?
Best place, bearingarms.com, where I am editor. You can also check out Bearing Arms Cam and Company, where we occasionally talk to Stephen and a lot of other folks. In fact, on Monday's Cam and Company, we're going to be talking about a decision out of Virginia, where a federal judge ruled that the federal ban on handgun sales to under 21s is unconstitutional. We've got the main attorney in that case. He's going to be joining us on Cam and Company on Monday. So you can find that YouTube, Rumble, all the major podcast platforms as well.
All right. Wonderful. Well, we'll have to have you on again in the future to catch back up on all these details once we've got some more developments down the line.
And I will be emailing your corporate minders to see if you can get permission to come on my show again, because it's been too long for that too.
Yes.
So we got to have you back on Cam and Company.
Absolutely. I'm sure CNM will let me. I don't think we'll have a problem. But yes, but they get first rights because they pay for it. So I can't complain.
I can pay in farm fresh eggs if you want. That's about all I can afford.
Well,
but,
up until very recently, I think that might have been the exchange rate between eggs and dollars is pretty high. So. All right. Well, we will talk to you again real soon. Thanks, Cam.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephen.
All right. I'm back with contributing writer Jake Fogelman to give a little bit of a news update. And before we get to that, though, I think we can continue my ongoing saga with my new carry gun, my new holster situation. It's it's not a disaster, but so I cut the little piece out of the Alien Gear Kydex to make the shield around the optic fit in there, right? And that works. It fits properly now. But the issue that I have is that that optic shield catches on my belt when I go to put the holster into my pants. So that's not ideal.
Right.
Because it makes it kind of pushes it out a little bit from being fully seated, which I figured out a way to, so I figured out a way to wrangle it in there. So it's so that the belt goes over top of the shield and the optic instead of the optic getting caught on the belt and getting slightly pushed out of full seat. So I have a workaround, but it's not ideal. Right?
It's just another obstacle.
Yeah, it's just another thing. And when that happens, it prints so much more too, because the gun sticks up a little bit higher.
Sure.
So that's not good. And it's a little bit bigger of a gun than what I'm used to with the Springfield XDS. This X Macro, the 6-hour P365 X Macro is just a bigger gun overall. Not a lot bigger, especially considering how much more capacity. It's like more than double capacity. But with that optic on there, it's, taller, I guess. And so it's a little bit hard to conceal, especially if it gets pushed up slightly out of being fully seated in that holster. So
right.
That little piece of plastic, I think was actually fairly important. So I really have to talk to them and see if they can send me the proper plastic piece that will actually go around because it's ridiculous to me, right? Like that's how they sell that gun, right? SIG sells that gun with that optic on it, with the shield installed. So the Kydex should fit that, right?
You would think so.
It's not unreasonable.
Right.
It's a new gun. So look, these holster companies, they have to go out and get copies of every gun to make these molds. I get it. But, I'll call them up. Hopefully they've got a solution, because cutting off the shield bit works, but it's not great.
Right. It's not ideal.
So I don't know. Maybe I'll have to spend another couple $100 on finding the right holster or whatever.
That's the eternal fun. Curse of gun guys. It's a drawer full of holsters that once worked but don't work anymore.
Yeah, the cheap ones are of course almost never gonna really work for you, because that cheap appendix holster, I just don't think that's gonna work at all. And that was another one where it's like, okay, it doesn't fit. The optic cutout fits sort of. They need to do a little trimming on that too. That was CYA holsters, and the real problem was the front sight, because it has the raised front sight. It's like the suppressor height front sight on it from the factory, and that was causing binding. There's another one where it's like I can mess with this and it make it fit, but it's not ideal. And also I just couldn't find like a good comfortable way to carry that appendix with that size of a gun too. But you're still going strong with your setup, though, right?
Yeah, still happy. 5 years later, I have just a cheap Kydex appendix holster that's worked out pretty well for me, and it hasn't cracked yet. But I'm not carrying currently a red dot equipped pistol, and it doesn't have suppressor right sights or anything like that. So if I ever do want to make that jump, then I'm going to be in the same boat as you, trying to find one that will work with all the different configurations.
It's a whole world of pain out there with this stuff. This is why I've carried the same gun forever. I think that people fall into carrying that same gun because once you get it set up,
yeah, that's where I'm at.
You don't have to go through all this stuff in the future, but the capacity is worth the hassle. I'll just have to figure out a way to. Maybe I'll just have to buy some of these more expensive holsters. That's probably what the answer is. Usually, I tried to do cheap red dots at first too, and that didn't work either. So, buy once, cry once.
I was going to say, yeah.
But of course, some of even the expensive holsters that like are made with better optic cutouts and stuff, their lead times are like, some of them could be like 6 months. So like, what am I supposed to do before that anyway? But I don't know. Maybe I'll try the tier 1 thing next. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe Alien Gear will come through with a better Kydex replacement for me. But now I have to call them and go through that whole process too, which is not fun either. I wish it just worked. That's what I was paying for, right? Not that their holsters aren't super expensive, but they're not cheap either. You know? It's like an $80 holster. It wasn't a $20 holster, but regardless, at least it's still super comfortable to carry. That's huge.
Good.
And I got the red dot sighted in, so I'm pretty happy with the setup. It's just getting the kinks worked out now. Maybe with a new holster, maybe with a modified version of this holster. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, good luck.
There's plenty of people out there who don't like the Alien Gear holsters, and I don't think I would buy the other ones that they make, but I do like the 3.5 hybrid that has the metal plate, because then you get the actual retention. You get the trigger guard coverage. You get all the stuff you're looking for in a holster, but it's super comfortable is my thing I like about it. But, if I can't figure out the optics part of it, then I'll have to try something else. We'll see. But anyway, on to the news of the week. What do you got for us?
Yeah, so we got a few headlines. This one comes from the Albany Times Union. It's kind of an appendix to one of the links we linked to last week about how their red flag applications are way up ever since Hochul's executive order. Well, now the state police union, who represents the New York State Police, who are required under Hochul's executive order to do these red flag laws, they're saying that they are completely overwhelmed trying to process them, and to the point where it's actually distracting them from investigating other crimes. So it's just sort of an unintended consequences sort of story.
Yeah, Cam mentioned this in the main interview. I think they said they're up like 1,000% increase in red flag orders. This all stems from the Buffalo mass shooting where that guy had been. That whole situation is still a bit unclear to me, or odd to me, because he had been taken for evaluation at a mental health facility by the police. 6 months or so before his shooting, but for some reason that didn't qualify as an involuntary commitment, which would have disqualified him from owning guns altogether. But either way, the issue there was that they didn't use the red flag law on him after that point, and so he was still able to legally purchase guns, which then he bought an AR. A New York legal one, and then modified it to be to accept magazines, so detachable magazines. And so that's where that all stems from. This sort of the response was for the governor to kind of mandate that anytime the police would consider doing a red flag law, they have to a red flag order. They have to do one. They have to file one. So now we're seeing sort of the results of that.
And then next, speaking of Cam, he's got a story over at Bearing Arms about Rhode Island is actually advancing a assault weapon ban bill So this is sort of a continuation of a topic we've been covering pretty heavily. Is just the resurgence of state level assault weapon bans, plus, as the backdrop against sort of the legal battle against over their constitutionality. So it's just interesting to see another state potentially considering an assault weapon ban this year.
Yeah, the momentum for that politically in blue states is continuing, even as they're losing in court over them. I mean, there's been mixed results, to be fair.
Sure.
There have been several rulings against assault weapons bans as violating the Second Amendment. They've been stayed. So, like the Illinois ban is in effect right now. In fact, I think the police are trying to claim that the guns sold when it wasn't in effect are now illegal as well, which is pretty absurd. But this momentum, political momentum, is still there for these in blue, specifically in relatively deep blue states, but I don't think they really have long to put these in place because they're almost certainly all going to get struck down. That's my view of it, at least.
And there's potentially going to be Supreme Court oversight of it, as we covered in last week's episode. So, like you said, the clock's ticking. And
I
then
just think there's just inevitably they're not going to the legal momentum is on the side of these being unconstitutional. So
I think that's
right. We'll see.
And then the last headline we'll talk about, as we said last week, we also have many other headlines that you guys can check out at the newsletter. But this one comes from the Wall Street Journal. It's sort of a story about the major gun rights group, the Second Amendment Foundation. We've talked about them before. The Washington State Attorney General is currently investigating them for accusations of perhaps self-dealing with the group's funds. And then Alan Gottlieb, the head of the Second Amendment Foundation, is countersuing the Washington Attorney General over this whole debacle. But it's definitely a big story right now, I think, in the gun rights space.
Yeah, so I guess the accusations stem from the fact that Alan and his family own like a direct mail company that the Second Amendment Foundation does work with. So, there's potential conflict of interest there, sort of self-dealing accusations. I think there's a radio stations that they own as well that they sold to the Second Amendment Foundation. There's sort of self-dealing potential there, at least, right? That's what I guess is being investigated. Excuse me. And so the Second Amendment Foundation claims that they offer these services, they buy these services from Gottlieb at a market value, right, or below market value. Which is not an unheard of arrangement, right? That's how it can still be legal and ethical if they are in fact getting these services at market rates or below market rates. If they're selling services to their organization at a level that isn't outside of what they would be able to do with a company that wasn't owned by the officials at the Second Amendment Foundation then. And the Second Amendment Foundation has a board. There's some of this stuff it reminds me a lot of there's a nonprofit that runs the volunteer effort to lay wreaths at Arlington National Cemetery, right? Which I've volunteered with them before. And there was a similar story a couple years back about how the people who ran that nonprofit also owned the company that provided the wreaths to the nonprofit. So the nonprofit would buy the wreaths from this company that was owned by the people that ran the nonprofit. And so, this similar concerns were raised there. And it was a similar defense in that situation as well, where they had claimed that the services they were providing were at market rates or below market rates, and therefore it's not an issue. So, it'll be interesting to see what details come out about this. It's a significant amount of money. It's tens of millions over a period of time. This is over like a decade. This is not the same level of money that's involved in, say, the NRA situation, but still, obviously, it's important to get answers on these things. And the other side of it is that, as you noted, they filed a civil rights claim against the Washington Attorney General, claiming that he's undertaking this investigation as a means of a political attack, and that he was politically motivated, which, could well be, because it's a Attorney General who is obviously a very staunch gun control advocate, and this is a gun rights group. Similar situation to what you've seen in New York with the Attorney General there, Letitia James, and the NRA, where the NRA has claimed that her motivations are political. Of course, you can have both be true at the same time, where the person pushing for prosecution is politically motivated, and there are also legitimate legal and ethical issues going on. So this is the first story on this that I've seen. So we'll have to follow up, and hopefully we can have perhaps somebody from Second Amendment Foundation on the show to talk about this stuff and answer the hard questions on this topic. So we'll see. We'll try to get that arranged.
Yep. And then on to our news of the week. You had a couple stories about some major court rulings that were handed down. First of which was a federal ruling out of Virginia about young adults and handgun sales. If you want to tell us what happened there. Yeah.
So this is a pretty significant ruling, right? Because the federal judge in this case, he's looking at the federal law. This isn't just isolated to Virginia, as I've seen some people, seem to believe in other reports that I've seen on this. This is actually about the federal laws. This applies everywhere. And it's about the ban on sales of handguns to 18 to 20-year-olds. And this judge found that that's not constitutional. It's not consistent with the Second Amendment. He did a review of the historical traditions surrounding sales of guns to those under 21. And he found that there's no historical support for this type of sales restriction, right? Or purchasing restriction, really. And therefore, it can't stand under the Bruin test that the Supreme Court handed down last year. So that's a pretty significant thing. This is, this law is from the Brady Bill. So it's from the 1960s. From the Gun Control Act. And so it's not very old.
Right.
There just weren't these sorts of regulations on entire age groups of adults during the founding era. That's the basic conclusion that this judge came to. And so I guess the rule is still, the law is still in effect at this point, because the judge has asked the plaintiffs and the defense for orders on what he should do now that he's determined that the law is unconstitutional. But that those are due next week, I believe. So we'll see maybe the next week or two. It's very likely that law will be enjoined, although it's also extremely likely this will be appealed. So, yeah. And a stay will probably be issued, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think it's probably likely that you said like the defense will appeal this ruling. But what I do think is interesting is this has been one area of the law that I think has been the most consistent post-Bruin, where we've seen, we talked about the assault weapon bans and the magazine bans, how different judges have kind of come down on different sides of that issue. But in terms of gun rights for 18 to 20-year-olds, I don't think I can think of a single ruling that we've seen post-Bruin where a judge has said that those laws have been permissible.
There's seen many.
Oh, has there been
there
one?
There was the Florida.
That's right.
Ban.
That's right. Yep.
And this actually extends back from before Bruin. You had a number of rulings on the 18 to 20-year-old restrictions. There was one in California. There was another one in this circuit. This is the Fourth Circuit that we're talking about here. Back a couple of years ago, that also found that you can't restrict. Actually, it was on the same law. The problem, so this is actually a repeat ruling, I guess I should explain, because there was a panel in the Fourth Circuit that found this restriction was unconstitutional. The problem was that became moot after the plaintiff in the case turned 21.
Yeah.
So it's no longer an active case, which is one of the hard parts, I guess, of challenging these age-based restrictions, because the cases can take several years, and an 18-year-old can turn 21 before the case ends, and they're no longer affected by this ruling. So it's that is another issue that these sort of plaintiffs face in these cases. But yeah, there was the one sort of outlier that we've seen, because you also had Texas lost their case on concealed carry for 18 to 20-year-olds.
Tennessee as well.
Yeah,
Minnesota as well. Yeah.
It's been a lot of there's been a lot on the side of 18 to 20-year-olds gun rights at this point. But there was the Florida ruling, which is a panel of the 12th Circuit that happened this year, that found Florida has basically a total ban on sales of all guns to 18 to 20-year-olds. Now, that doesn't seem likely to stand given all the other the trend on this recently, but yeah, there has been that one significant outlier.
But it's definitely an interesting body of law to see, because there's been a ton of division post Bruin where judges have gone any which way, and we only have the one case here, which, as you said, may not fully stand. And I think the legislature has even talked about repealing that law in the first place, so that could also be.
Although they didn't repeal it. I think there's a lot of the hope is left on this is probably going en banc in the 12th panel. This was a panel of 3 judges in the 12th Circuit that ruled in favor of this law, and now it's going to be heard by the full circuit, which is relatively conservative circuit. So we'll see how they come out, but I would be very surprised if that law survived scrutiny there, especially because it's a much broader ban. It's a ban on basically
total sales,
a total ban on buying guns by 18 to 20-year-olds. But yeah, so that's a super significant ruling. And then we had another one, right?
I was gonna say, you wrote about this time a gun law actually being upheld, and it's another federal provision under the Gun Control Act about people that are involuntarily committed being prohibited from owning guns, and the court found that's okay, that's permissible.
Yeah,
tell us
so
what went into that.
Similar situation where the judge looked at the historical tradition of firearms regulations during the founding era, because that's what Bruin requires, right? And except this time he found that there was a significant tradition of barring specifically people who are dangerously mentally ill, not just all mentally ill, not just anyone who has any sort of mental illness diagnosis, because that's not what the law applies to, right? Sure. The law applies to people who are adjudicated as a threat to themselves or others, right? That's the standard in the federal law. So they have to actually have been found to be a threat to themselves or others and committed on that basis. So, it's not just anyone who's been diagnosed as bipolar or has depression or what have you. So on that basis, he found that there is a historical tradition that dates back to the founding era and before and after, which allows the government to disarm dangerous mentally ill people. Now, he did admit that there was not a exact replica of the modern version of this law in the founding era. So maybe, I don't know, perhaps on appeal there'll be some more controversy over this. We'll see. But he said that the way that government officials operated in the founding era is consistent with the fact that they were allowed to take firearms from somebody who was considered dangerously mentally ill.
And I think this is interesting, one, because we've seen sort of a split again in terms of the prohibitory offenses that are listed under the Gun Control Act about what can stand and what can't. For example, felon in possession laws have been pretty consistently upheld. Yep. But you've seen some of the more controversial rulings like the DV restraining order ruling and the federal felony indictment ruling. So this is one where obviously the court erred on the side of the federal government and said that's permissible. But I think it also might have implications based on the criteria he laid out, potentially for red flag laws. We haven't seen too many federal red flag law challenges, but if there's a history, as this judge is saying, of taking guns from people that are dangerously mentally ill, I think that's an interesting criteria to look forward, as inevitably red flag laws will get challenged.
It could be. There was one ruling against red flag laws in New York.
In New York, yeah.
Right.
But I believe that centered more on due process rather than the actual act of taking the firearms from. Which
I think is probably the more fertile ground for legal challenges anyway. But it could be. None of these things are necessarily fully settled, and the Supreme Court is probably going to have to step in sooner rather than later on some of these things, especially because they're dealing with federal laws. Now we're seeing several of these federal laws get struck down, at least provisions of them. And that's where the Supreme Court is generally more apt to intervene and explain itself in those cases in a much quicker manner than otherwise. So we will certainly keep on top of that, of course, and follow all of the latest developments with guns in America. But right now, we actually have a member segment that we're going to head on over to. So let's go. All right. Well, it's time for one of my favorite segments, the member segment, where we get to know some of you Reload members out there. This week, we have Frank Phillips, who's actually a new member to the Reload, on with us. How are you doing, Frank?
Great, Stephen. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Welcome to the show. We appreciate you coming on and talking with us a little bit, just to help us get to know you a little bit better. Why don't we just start off with a little bit of just basic information about yourself? Where you live?
Sure.
What state?
I'm in Alabama, central Alabama. Okay. Yeah. And was born here. Have lived here for the past 33 years, right out since college.
Wow. Yeah. Nice. And what kind of job do you do? What field are you in?
I work for a very large company that air is supposed to be free and water is supposed to be free and rocks are supposed to be free. But the company I work for makes rocks. We take big rocks and we crush them into little rocks and we sell billions of dollars worth of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. So are you near Little Rock, Arkansas by any chance?
No. We're based in Birmingham.
Maybe you should consider moving to Little Rock just for the synergy of the name.
That's right. That's right.
That's great, and you've been there a long time too, right?
Yeah, for over 3 decades. Yeah, it's a lifelong career for me.
That's incredible. That's rare these days, right? People used to do that. That's how it used to be. Stay at the same company for a long time, but now you don't see it as much, and so it must be you must like working there, I guess, right?
Oh yeah, it's provided a lot of stability, and it's got a great culture, and it's really been a pretty big blessing. I get to leave work every day and come home to my wife and kids, and I've been able to raise my children comfortably and securely and with stability.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about your relationship with firearms. Do you own guns? Did you grow up around guns? How'd that turn out for you?
Yeah, all of the above. I've been shooting ever since I was a kid. My father had guns, and we took me out shooting and did some hunting, not a whole lot. But then in college and after college, I started collecting. And I tell you, I think everybody has this feeling at one time or another, and it's the regret of having sold a gun later on that you just are just slapping yourself. Why did I sell that?
That's so true. I feel that way about one of my 1911s that I sold. And sometimes I'm like, why did I sell that? I don't.
Oh yeah, I had a hard chrome P7, the squeeze cocker that I sold. That I just never should have sold that, and an original nickel Sig 228 that was part of an FBI contract in the early 90s, and just very few of those. They're extremely rare, and of course I sold that one. Should never have sold that one.
So what do you usually focus on with your collecting? What kind of guns?
Well, I'm a big fan of the Glock 19, so I have several of those. And of course, these days, the past couple of years, as I mentioned earlier, I've gotten into suppressors and SBRs.
Okay.
So for example, this little gem, this is a Ruger Charger. It started life as a pistol, and did a Form 1 on it. And this is about as much fun as you can have at the range.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is a silencer co switchback. So yeah, this is fun for the whole family.
Yeah. Let's suppress 22, the short barrel. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Is it 22?
That's a 22. Right? Yeah, and it takes 10-22 magazines. It's a Ruger. Yeah.
That does sound like fun.
It is fun. Yeah, and
I always enjoy my 10-22. It's one of my favorite guns to shoot.
No doubt. And I did a few upgrades to it. I put in the Ruger BX trigger, which was about $90. Yeah, and it really improves it. And I put a few Volquartz and parts in it. I think an extractor and firing pin.
That's some fancy stuff right there.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, suppress 22 as well is just a real joy to shoot. There's just not much sound coming out of that, and nice light recoil. You can get real accurate with those as well. A lot of fun. Cheap ammunition. It's got all the great plinking benefits that you could think of, right?
Oh yeah, and of course when you put a suppressor on, it increases reliability. So you can put just about any load you want. And shooting subsonic rounds through these things it's great. You don't even need hearing protection.
Yeah, that's when they actually start to sound like the movies, right?
Yeah.
It's like one of the only suppressed guns that actually sounds like they do in the movies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because as you know, a suppressed gun in real life, the silencer, that may be the name that Hiram Maxim came up with for them, but they don't actually make the guns silent, right? As anyone who's ever shot them knows.
Just like a muffler doesn't make a car silent.
Yeah, exact same technology invented by the same person.
Yep,
right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. But they certainly do make shooting more enjoyable. I would say that.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. No doubt. And I think I've got some Axle hearing protection that it lets in anything under 80 decibels. So when you're talking and you're on the range, you can have a normal conversation with people, but then anything over 80 decibels, it's going to cancel out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Those are always nice. Especially I think I have the walkers that have the microphones in them.
Same thing. Yeah.
It's always an interesting experience too, because it can also give you like a weird, the spatial audio is weird with those headphones. So you can get kind of disoriented a little bit, but they are super useful, especially for like younger shooters or beginner shooters who aren't used to, having the full range of decibels blocked out by hearing protection and trying to communicate. They're really good for anyone, right? Because you can communicate with people a lot easier with those sorts of hearing protection, but I think they're especially beneficial for people who aren't used to going out and shooting, right?
Absolutely. And, I've always loved the little orange foam things, but once you put those in, if you want to hear anything else, you got to take it out and say, "What did you say?" And then put them back in.
Or you got to shout at each other. Yeah. It's certainly having those more modern options is ideal, right?
Yeah.
You can actually go out to the range, you can protect your hearing, and you can protect your voice too, right? But because you don't have to shout all the time.
Absolutely.
So it's very nice. And then, having the suppressor there as well just adds another level of convenience and safety to it as well. So it's really advantageous.
Yeah.
Plus the suppressors, and a lot of people don't realize that they also reduce recoil, right?
Absolutely. And especially when you're at a public range, we've all been next to the guy who's shooting his AR 5.56 pistol and this huge fireball and the percussion, or the guy on your left shooting a 44 Magnum. And, the nice thing about suppressors is it's a friendly thing to do to your neighbors at the range.
Oh yeah, certainly. And so what's your favorite suppressor? You have a number of them, right? So what one do you like best?
Yeah, I think I have 2 Omega 9Ks, and that's this one. So this is on an MP5.
So short boy.
Yeah, and it's it's got a tri-lug mount, so it just comes off like that, and twists on like that. Very simple to use. And then I've got it.
Nice.
Yeah, so that was dedicated for the tri-lug because I've got 2 MP5 clones, and then another one I have. I usually have a 1/2x28 just for using on everything else. Yeah. I will say it's very versatile. Oh, and it'll also do 300 blackout subsonic.
Oh, okay.
So it'll, I've used it on 9mm and on my 300 blackout.
Well, it's a nice variety.
Yeah, it really is. It'll also do 38 special too.
Well,
yeah.
And I think that the first one you showed that for those listening at home, that's a modular suppressor, right?
Yeah, the switchback. You can. There's four configurations you can put on it. It all comes apart, but there's one that's called rifle optimized, where essentially you take this part and you reverse the baffles, and then you put it back together. And so if your barrel is at least 10 inches long, that it's a fantastic sound reduction. But anyway, I could also take the end of this off, this long part, and put it, and you can use it as a tiny little thing. I've seen people do it to those little Beretta Bobcats or the 22 Bobcat. So it's a tiny little gun with a tiny little suppressor. It's pretty versatile.
That's fantastic. You have to get a suppressor. I mean, obviously the process is it's certainly not as easy as going in and just buying a gun. But it is doable. There's a lot of, there have been some improvements in the ATF process, I guess, recently with the electronic filing, but it still takes several months, right? Usually for one of these to go through.
Well, it's running around 300 days now.
Oh, okay. That's so much better.
Well, it's almost a year. It's.
Oh wait, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
300 days. Yes, that is almost a year. That's so not better. Very bad.
Yeah, and it's and it varies. I mean, there are you can read on some forums and there'll be a fluke that some guy had it in and 4 weeks later it was approved, but no, it's running a long time. I still have a few more that are pending.
Well, it's probably only going to get worse, right? If this pistol brace rule actually goes into effect, which we're still waiting on a couple court cases to see if anything's going to come in before the end of the month when it's supposed to go into effect, because that's supposedly their solution there is to have millions of people file new Form 4s, right?
Form 1,
register, Form 1s to register these pistol braced guns. I don't know how many people are actually going to do that, but if even a small percentage do, that's going to be a huge tax on the current system, which, as you just mentioned there, is already pretty slow.
Yeah, and in fact, it may not be a Form 1. I think you're right. I think it is a Form 4 because, according to the government, if you have a braced pistol, in their eyes, it is already a short-barreled rifle.
Right.
And so to register it, I think you would do a Form 4.
Right.
Otherwise, a Form 1 is for making one.
Yeah. So we'll have to see how that turns out. But I imagine it's hard to see how it wouldn't drastically increase wait times for current NFA items like suppressors. But we'll have to see. So just give us a little bit more about how you found the reload here. What made you get interested in our publication and becoming a member?
Well, honestly, I don't remember exactly how I found it. I think it was a link that I must have been reading an article, and your site was referenced, and so I thought, well, I'll go look at that. And I went in and I looked at it, and I read some of your articles, and I really enjoyed them. And then I got in my car, and I'm like, I'm going to download one of those podcasts. and I listened to it, driving back and forth to work, and loved it. And so now I'm kind of working my way backwards on your podcast.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I love them. You get these guys on, and like the guy from Pepperdine,
Jake Charles. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Koppel.
David Koppel.
David Koppel. Yeah. Very knowledgeable people, and hearing y'all discuss these things just is very enlightening, because at the core we all know that gun control for its stated purpose will never work, because criminals by definitions don't obey laws. So if the purpose of gun control is to keep them out of the hands of criminals, that's never going to work. But getting into the deeper issues of the litigating these and the state courts and the federal courts, that's really interesting, and I've really enjoyed listening to this and your podcast and reading the articles.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, we try to have that variety of viewpoints too, so that you're not just stuck in one echo chamber, right? And we try to get people who have expertise in whatever given topic we're talking about that week, and so I'm glad to hear that that's paying off well. That people are enjoying in that level of calm, informed discussion, because that is exactly what we're going for here. So that's fantastic. So what's your plan from here? You think you're gonna go deeper into the collecting realm, or are you gonna buy more and more interested in suppressors, or how do you see yourself moving forward?
I need to shoot more, and I get to the right? Yeah. The thing is, I don't know if you've ever heard of you've heard of the CMP marksmanship program, civilian marksmanship program. Well, just down the road in Anniston, Alabama, is where one of the CMPs is, and it's a world-class range. And I get out there maybe every 6 weeks or so. But I think I want to go out and shoot more.
So you don't want to be the kind of collector that just has their guns on the wall. You want to go out and actually shoot these things. Get use out of it.
Especially with suppressors. They're just fun.
Yeah.
So true. I think I'd like to get out a lot more.
Yeah.
And you're a certified safety instructor, right?
Yes, I'm certified to teach the NRA's basic pistol course, and I use that actually as part of training when I do classes for the National Journalism Center, and so I mean, even I would like to get out and go shooting a lot more often than I get to, especially because I live here in Northern Virginia, right in Alexandria area, and so the only ranges that are really close by are all indoor ranges, which is not ideal, or they're like private ranges you always you have to know somebody to sponsor you and it's a long process and it's expensive, but I go to I have a year membership at my local indoor range, but I'd love to get out and shoot more outdoors, honestly, than I'm able to.
Yeah, that's what I love about the CMP range in Anniston. Yeah. It's all outdoors. They have skeet ranges, trap ranges, sporting clays, a 600-yard range, pistol ranges, action pistol. That
sounds wonderful. Awesome.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Anybody in between Atlanta and Birmingham should go and see that facility. It's world class.
That sounds fantastic. I'll have to take a trip down there sometime. Maybe we go shooting together.
Yeah. Let me know. Let me know when you're in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we really appreciate you joining the show and giving us a little bit of insight into yourself and your collecting and how you came across the Reload. We really appreciate you coming on. But that's it for this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. Make sure you guys like and rate and share this show. It helps us tremendously when you do that. And if you want to become a Reload member as well, you can head over to our website, thereload.com, and check out membership options where you get exclusive access to members only pieces that you won't be able to find anywhere else, and the opportunity to come on the show for a member segment, my favorite segment. So please consider doing that. That is how we support our reporting here. That is our only source of revenue at this point. And so that's what keeps us going. But until next week, we will see you guys.
No, the devil's got no